Good afternoon from Center for Healthy Sex here in Los Angeles. I'm Dr. Alex Katehakis, and today is January 8th, 2018. Our topic today from Mirror of Intimacy is awkwardness. I want to welcome you to our monthly webinar and to remind you that Facebook is a public forum, so anything you type into the text box can be seen by everybody, so please keep that in mind. I do want you to ask questions, because the more questions you ask, the more interactive this webinar is, and the more oftentimes when you ask a question, it inspires other listeners or participants to think about certain things and ask questions themselves. If you want to ask a question anonymously, you don't want to see it posted on Facebook, please contact Charlie at centerforhealthysex.com. He's standing by and he can send me your questions anonymously if that's helpful to you. So this is our first webinar of 2018, and I'm really delighted that the series has gone on as long as it has. Mirror of Intimacy was a labor of love that started out as a tiny idea in 2000. Well, I think we published it in 2014, so probably in 2013, because it took us about a year to write the book. That's really burgeoned into a community conversation. I meet people wherever I go from all walks of life who are constantly bringing to my attention that they've read the book or that they know about it. So I just want to reiterate how much we appreciate your readership and how much we appreciate you passing this information along to people, because with our current climate right now culturally, what's happening with the Me Too movement and sort of the general conversation about sex and sexuality, I think we need a lot of voices and we need a lot of conversation about what constitutes healthy sex. So the more you think about it, the more you talk about it, the more you try it in your own relationships, the more you're working to heal our sexuality as a collective. So I'm delighted that we're gathering here in this forum as a community today to talk about this conversation or this topic of awkwardness, which is sort of an awkward topic. And as we go along, I'd like you to ask yourself the question, do you feel awkward in areas of your life? And how might these feelings be related to shame? So I'm going to pause for a minute as you hear that siren in the background. So yes, I think oftentimes awkwardness is about self-consciousness, and that self-consciousness is coming from a feeling of shame and even a lack of sense of my confidence and my sense of self. So as we look at the quotation from today, it's by Edward Carpenter, who was a poet, who says, "How difficult, how tragic even, must often, by the fate of those whose deepest feelings are destined from the earliest days to be a riddle and a stumbling block, unexplained to themselves, passed over in silence by others." Now, obviously, this is an old quote because the language is stilted in an old way. But let's look at it. How difficult, how tragic even must it be when by the fate of others, meaning that others bring their own fate or their own history to us, where their deepest feelings from their earliest days, say from their childhoods, are a riddle and a stumbling block to them. I mean, what that sentence says to me is that those people don't know who they are. That's sort of a convoluted way of saying they don't have a sense of self, they don't know who they are, and they bring those projections and that awkwardness really to us. And in this quote, he's saying it's unexplained to themselves because it may even be dissociated. They don't even know that they don't know who they are. And it's passed over in silence by others. I would interpret that in some way to mean that when we experience people like that, we don't really bother with them. We sort of hope they'll go away. We don't give them the feedback that we should give them. We don't help each other, in effect. So when I think of awkwardness, sometimes I think of emotional invisibility. And there is a well-known neuropsychoanalyst in New York called Philip Bromberg. And Dr. Bromberg talks about the ways in which we are translated out of existence in our families of origin. And that creates an emotional invisibility. And oftentimes not having grace or social skills is a result of a childhood that's marked by emotional invisibility, or where our primary caregivers translate certain states of being out of existence. So in other words, it's not acceptable to be angry, or it's not acceptable to voice your feelings to other people, that you always have to have a smile on your face and be the good girl or good boy. That makes us emotionally invisible when that's sort of the law that's laid down in the family. So Paul says you're also talking about intergenerational transmission, a transfer of shame, and that's accurate and true. But this emotional, these are two separate things, but they go hand in hand. When I talk about emotional invisibility, I'm talking about certain self states that are sequestered, that are translated out of existence, as Bromberg says, that make us emotionally invisible. And part of why that happens is because those states were shamed. We were told that's dirty, or it's bad, or it's inappropriate, so it's not okay to do it. So it's the shame that acts as a barrier to our other ways of being in the world, our fullness, our uniqueness, really. And people who feel awkward in life, and especially awkward in sex, were typically not seen, heard, understood, or cherished as children. And oftentimes, we're so far away from talking about sexual pleasure because we're still trying to deconstruct the awkwardness of shame and these dissociated self states. I saw an ad over the holiday about vaginal rejuvenation. And so I read it, or it was actually an article about it. And this process is a process of restoring tone and texture and collagen to the vaginal canal for women who have struggled or have had, gone through birth or menopause, where those structures and functions are changing. And it makes sense that they're using the technology that they're using for facial procedures in the vaginal canal. But nowhere in this article did it mention women's sexual pleasure. It all had to be couched in this kind of medical concern that medically your body's not functioning the way it should, and so you should be able to get your functioning back. But it didn't boldly come forward and say, by the way, you'll have more sexual pleasure also, because that sounded a little bit too racy for this particular newspaper, I think. So we're talking here about the desire, and I think the desire, or the overarching message of Mirror of Intimacy, is sexual potential, which includes sexual pleasure. But when I talk about awkwardness, I really am talking about these shame states and these self states that aren't available to us. And I think everybody knows what I'm talking about, because whenever you feel sort of a deadness at the core of your being, or a lack of ability to get super excited or exuberant about something, or you sort of feel limp in your body, like you wish you could hug in a more physical, robust way, but you're sort of awkward about it, or you're unsure, or you're always checking the other person. These are self states that have been shamed away from us. We want to put it that way. And shame goes hand in hand with awkwardness, as Paul pointed out to us, that many people who feel awkward, especially when it comes to sex, were sexually shamed or were sexually abused. And sexual abuse, by definition, has sexual shame in it. But sexual shame can come in the subtlest of messages, by, a parent saying, "Well, you're not wearing that, are you?" Or, "Wow, where'd you get that outfit?" These are the kind of messages females hear, and the message is it's not quite right, or there's a shaming about it, instead of a direct message where the parent is saying, "Sweetie, I think that might be a little bit too revealing. What do you think about that?" And let the teenager argue why it's what all our friends are wearing. And then there's a conversation about, if you're going to wear that, know what the message is that you're giving to boys and therefore men down the road. And how do you protect yourself, and what are your boundaries? So there is a whole context of conversation for the parent expressing their discomfort with the way their child is dressed, so that the child and the parent can be in a conversation with each other. Oftentimes the parents feel so much shame they don't know how to talk about it, so they just lay a shaming message out there, and it gets stuck literally in the child's body, because we all know what that feeling is of walking around with shame. And shame will create a sexual awkwardness without a doubt. So overcoming sexual trauma is the first step on the road to recapturing our natural grace and ease with sex and sexuality. And these are little traumas, day after day, week after week, where you feel like the culture in the family is one of being sex negative, or because nobody talks about sex, or sex is thought to be something that you just stay away from or avoid, or be careful about how you do it, because there's no real conversation about it. And that will create a traumatized being, because they're going to be a shame-based being. That's very different from overt and egregious messages about sex and sexuality. So I only see one comment here. I see Ryan saying hello. So hello, Ryan. Thank you for joining us. I know sometimes these Facebook messages can come in a little slowly, so please make sure you are typing them in. So Paul says, when one of these invisible dissociations wakes up, my fear is that it will be likely to do something. Sorry, I'm having just a little bit of trouble with my screen here. My fear is that it will be really likely to do something inappropriate out of an experience and lack of artfulness. Then what then? Okay, so I think what you're saying here is, yes, when you are dissociated, you don't even know what you don't know about yourself. And so there will be an awkward move that takes place because you're just doing the best that you can. And it won't be very artful. It will be awkward, which is the opposite of that. So the best thing always is to check it out with your partner. I think there's a lot of pressure still on men to know when to make the right move on their partner, especially heterosexual males and heterosexual females, that the male is supposed to initiate and take the lead. And so I find it's always useful for people to ask first, and that creates a different kind of awkwardness. It creates sort of a wholesomeness, a vulnerability, if you will, that says, I'm not that smooth and that debonair because I don't know your history. I don't know your past. I don't know if touching your arm feels like a gesture of affection and also a signal that I'm interested in you, or it feels like you're about to be, accosted because you were raped or you were molested, and any kind of unwanted gesture makes your nervous system jump and you feel like something's just been done inappropriately to you. So what would happen if you asked somebody that you were dating or courting, can I hold your hand? Or I have this really strong impulse to kiss you right now. And see what that person says. If they have a look of horror, that means that they're not interested, and so it's a good thing you asked. And if they say, I want to kiss you too, that's your green light. And so there's something sweet and vulnerable, and it also slows the process down. So there's not this lunging at sex and sexuality. There's a quietness to it. The arousal comes from this sort of awkwardness, but there can be an intensity that follows with that too. So be willing to be uncool, to be vulnerable, to be awkward, to have this be a wholesome experience that allows you to figure out more about what your own rhythms are too, what you like, and also that you're exploring the rhythms of this person in front of you. That you can't assume that they like sex the way that you like sex. Just like you can't assume that people like anything the way that you like it anymore. There are too many options in life. So relating to your sexual partner, to your lover as a real person is a really good idea. And so that was a great question. So any other questions that people might have? So you might wonder then, excuse me, how do I overcome awkwardness? And I think the answer to that is slowly. And I think that's really what's going on here, is that as we heal ourselves, and it's not just dissociation, it's also repression. What we repress, what we once liked, and then somehow we were told it was bad, and then we've shut it down, which is different than dissociation, where you never really knew what you did or didn't like, because you didn't have the option to, because sex was used as a form of violence against you. But if you really ask yourself, and especially those of you that are in recovery from sexual addiction, I think this is a really important topic of, what did you like in your sex addiction that you've had to stop doing because it was too compulsive and problematic? And how can you pluck out pieces of what you liked and introduce them into your sex life in a way that's healthy? Meaning that you've been in communication with a therapist, with a trusted other, with a partner, to talk about why you like this particular sexual act, and how can you do it in a way that's sex positive and increases your sexual potential, rather than you feeling shameful about it. So that's a big proposition, if you will, trying to figure that out. So when you've done the major work of reclaiming your sexuality, and I think that is an ongoing thing. I don't think we just reclaim our sexuality. I think it's an ongoing investigation, because what you like sexually in your 20s is going to change when you're in your 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. So when you start to come out of shame, the way you come out of shame is by talking about your sexuality, about talking about what you like sexually, and then feeling awkward as you talk about it to the people around you, and feeling awkward as you talk about it to a lover, and then feeling awkward as you try it, and overcoming that when you surrender to the pleasure that the sex act brings you. All of that is a process that we have to go through. So Zarina writes, as you said before, there is some numbness inside regarding self-awareness and self-feeling. What are the tools to get more sensitive sexually? Well, that is a very good question. And it's sort of a complicated question, again, because everybody's different. But when you have a numbness internally around your sexuality and you're aware of it, the big challenge is to dive into the numbness rather than push it away or ignore it or try to figure it out with your brain, cognitively figure it out. It's the willingness to sit quietly, and often in the presence of a therapist, because we need that sort of feedback from the other person in front of us. But to really take a moment and to close your eyes and to notice the numbness. Are you feeling the numbness in your chest, around your heart? Is it in your solar plexus, which is the center of energy in our body? Or is it lower? Is it in your genitals, where you feel dead in your pelvis? And what does that deadness feel like? What do you notice when you dive into the feeling? Does it feel vaporous, or does it feel like a cloud of smoke? Does it feel just vast and black? Does it have a weight to it? Does it have a sensation to it? Does it have a shape to it, perhaps? And continue to explore and hopefully narrate to someone who's qualified to help you what you're noticing, because it's in that exploration that those circuits start to recouple with each other, that you start to feel a feeling again. And maybe that feeling is that you feel sick to your stomach because you were tampered with sexually as a child. And that's been the feeling that you've been dissociating from, that you don't want to feel again. Or it makes you start sobbing uncontrollably. We're so phobic of these feeling states, but we must go back and feel them in order to have any kind of neural integration. And that's why it's important to go into those places with a trusted other, so you don't just feel so alone, or you don't re-traumatize yourself. But ignoring that numbness, or trying to override it with your willpower or your intellect is only going to put you in situations where you're going to re-traumatize yourself, because you'll tell yourself that you just have to suck it up and go have sex again. And when you do, all of that trauma is going to come up again. So be gentle with yourself. Practice great self-compassion as you wade into these traumatized areas. So thank you for that question, Zarina. That was a really good question. Ham writes, dissociated states. You said you don't know what you don't know. How do we bring awareness to these states when they occur and learn to return to balance? Well, I think that ties to the answer to the question I just gave, is that when you say that you are dissociated, it's usually because you feel nothing. People that are pathologically dissociated don't have any feelings in their body. They can't report any feelings in the body. So that's a pretty extreme case of it. So it's with a somatic or body-oriented therapist that you want to start to explore these dead states, these cut-off states, because it's in the noticing, in the exploration of it, that you start to feel again. So you can't force the feeling, you can't figure it out intellectually, you can't read a book that's going to have you feeling these feelings again. You have to go through the awkward discomfort of starting to feel again. And most of us, as I said earlier, are so afraid of our feeling states. We're not afraid of laughter or joy or fun or play or feeling happy or good, because those are socially acceptable states. When somebody says, "How are you today?" we all say fine, which is the most boring answer possible. But if I were really to check in with myself and say, how am I feeling today? What's the feeling state in my body? You might say, wow, I'm noticing I'm feeling really sad today, or I'm angry all the time. So just let yourself be angry all the time. Be the angry person until you can get to the bottom of what that is. Or be the sad person, because sad is not depressed. Angry is not depressed. Being in a state of physical or emotional pain is not depressed. Depressed is just dullness. It's just deadness. So we want to see colors of the rainbow, all of them, instead of naming them as, well, I like that color, but I don't like that color. And wow, I can't show blue to the world. I can only show yellow to the world. And I think this conversation about being awkward is risking being all of who you are. And saying, yeah, I'm a hot mess, but I know that I am, and I'm working on it, and I'm trying every day to let myself feel whatever this body is feeling and not make excuses or apologies for it. So Terry writes, how does a woman assist in overcoming the sexual awkwardness from her spouse when he's reached a point in his sexual addiction recovery where sex is now possible? So I just want to understand this, Terry. You're saying, how does a woman assist in overcoming the sexual awkwardness from her spouse? It sounds like he feels sexually awkward. Is that accurate? So it sounds like he's ready to be sexual again, and you're ready to be sexual again, but he's feeling sexually awkward. Well, in some ways, yes, you want to assist him, you want to be a good friend, but again, this is his responsibility to talk about how awkward he feels and how awkward the two of you feel together, and to let that be okay, and to say, we're going to awkwardly hold each other here, or we're going to awkwardly, he's awkward. So I'd be curious about what his awkwardness is about. My guess is it's about his shame, and his shame about what he did and what he's done to you. And until he can get through that shame, it's going to be very difficult for him to be assertive towards you sexually. So it seems to me that the two of you have to have a conversation that's probably a difficult conversation about what this awkwardness is about, because as I stated earlier, and someone else aptly pointed out, there is shame underneath the awkwardness. So does he feel ashamed? I'm repeating myself now, but does he feel ashamed of what he did to you, that he's hurt you? Is he ashamed of the behaviors he had engaged in? Or is he ashamed because there are certain sexual behaviors he likes and he's afraid to tell you about that? Where is the shame coming from, and how willing is he to be honest about it? Because without that, you're not going to have a robust and fun sex life. And one of the tragedies of sex addiction is that it takes play states out of sex and sexuality. And if he's feeling awkward, it's very difficult for him to be playful with you, excited by you, excited by his own sexuality and his own pleasure. So I would think the two of you need more constructive conversation about this before you actually have intercourse. And remember, there are a million ways to have sex, probably not a million actually. There really aren't that many sexual positions and that many things people can get into sexually, but there are different contexts and things that people like and enjoy. And so as such, you really want to make a space to have these conversations with each other. So you're saying that he thought you were uncomfortable and you weren't. He misread you, and he hasn't said anything about that. So that's a deflection to say, well, I thought you were uncomfortable. It's like, don't take my inventory, which is language of the program, you can say to him. Or, why are you tracking me? Why aren't you tracking your own sexual pleasure? You're an adult woman. You're responsible for your own sexual pleasure. And you can tell him, if there's something I don't like or something I don't want, I'll tell you. And can he hear that without feeling wounded or feeling rejected? And maybe the two of you need to have a conversation before it even gets that far about what the two of you like and don't like sexually, what would be okay, what would make you uncomfortable. So I think his deflection is about him not taking responsibility for his sexuality. And that's really about him. So remind him that you will let him know if you're uncomfortable, but if you're with him and you're being seductive or you have your clothes off, you're probably pretty comfortable. So with this awkwardness, think about yourself as somebody who's beginning anything new. So you're learning a new dance step, or you're learning to play a musical instrument, and you don't really have any technique whatsoever. You may feel like any sexual attempt you make or any move you make is impossible for you. So maybe that is because you're not really ready, and you're acting like you are ready. So don't do that, because that again is about not being vulnerable. It's about being defensive and not being truthful also. It's a lie to say I'm ready to be sexual or I want to try the sex act when really I'm not. I'm scared, I'm uncomfortable. And you know, sometimes just talking about our fear and our discomfort with our partner, who's an active listener, who's got empathy for our fear or discomfort, just instantly makes it vaporize. It just makes it go away. And once we feel like we can trust the other person, or that it's going to be okay, we're willing to try it. And I think women especially, when they feel safe and respected, women are pretty much willing to try anything unless they've got some block from sexual abuse. But oftentimes women get pegged as not being open sexually or being unwilling. And typically it's because they don't feel safe or they don't trust. So keep that in mind also, that trust and safety are very important to being sexually adventurous. And when that awkwardness is around, you've got to check yourself and say, why am I feeling so awkward right now? Typically it's because I'm afraid to talk about something that's making me really uncomfortable. And so that's a sign to talk about it. So with practice and patience from yourself and your lover, because that's what I'm talking about, it's from both parties, you can recalibrate your nervous system to read sexual contact as something good rather than a setup for danger or rejection. And try as you might, if you were sexually abused or injured in any way, intellectually you might know that that was in the past, but viscerally your body's going to respond as if your lover is the assailant, and they're not. It becomes a case of mistaken identity. It's not what's happening in real time. So until you clean that trauma out in your own therapy and your own work, your lovers are always going to be the perpetrator. And they're coming there sort of minding their own business. They're coming for sexual pleasure, fun, play, to connect with you because they love you. And all of a sudden, something happens and they don't know what's going on because you're having a present day reaction to a past experience. And that's your responsibility to deal with that. It's not your partner's fault. They can't, there are certain things they can do, certainly, if you ask them to be more gentle or to make sure that you're making eye contact when they touch you, because your system tends to overreact in that way. There are some adjustments they can make, but we cannot completely contort ourselves to adjust to somebody who's been sexually abused if they haven't done their work. It's really not possible. So I'm just looking to see if we have any other questions from anybody here. Right, so remember, this is about progress, not perfection, about practice, about being patient, about being vulnerable and being awkward and having conversations. Sometimes you might start out having sex, or that's the intention, and then it stops and you don't know what's going on, and your partner, the first question that happens is, the person who desire stops or gets awkward or uncomfortable, stops what they're doing, and the other person says something like, "Are you okay?" Which can be an inflammatory question, or what's going on. But it's not a bad question, because there's a genuine desire to know, like, what just happened there. And if you're the person who is stopping the sex because you're in your head, because you're thinking about work, or because you don't like the way you're being touched, or because you're uncomfortable because you don't know if your partner likes what's going on, you need to just get honest, be a grown-up, be an adult. This isn't a movie that you're in where you've got to be all, sexually athletic and perfect. It's just about being a human being. And maybe you get into a really rich and soulful conversation that ends up in a deeper understanding with each other that has you eventually, leading back to sex in a much more connected way. So take risks when you can sexually. Don't be afraid. Someone says, even when we have done the psychotherapy, the body work itself will still take a lot of time. Yes, it does. It does take a lot of time. And so you're doing body psychotherapy and you're also having sex with your partner, because sex with your partner can be unbelievably healing, because you're going to get activated when you're having sex with your partner. You will get triggered, and that's your opportunity to use what you learned in therapy, or to notice what's happening in your body the way you've learned to notice in therapy, to talk about it with your sex partner, and to see if you can slowly start to ease through those difficulties. And if you can't, just notice how far you can go, and don't push your body past the point where it can go, or make a big story about what's happening. Just be present in the moment. In some ways, this is a mindfulness practice. It's about present awareness and not judging what's good or bad. So, for example, if you were to look out your window right now, if I look out my window, it's gray, it's rainy. I see the tops of buildings, which aren't terribly attractive. There's some palm trees with some dead palm fronds on them. There's sort of electrical wires. There's a landscape outside. And if I just notice each thing in detail, it sort of looks like a moody winter rainy day picture. That's it. If I complain about it, I can start judging it and saying, well, that rooftop's ugly, and what happens if people don't, clean the palm fronds off their trees, and I wish it weren't raining, why isn't it sunny, and these electrical wires are hideous. And I can just complain and complain and complain about the nature of the day. And if that day were my sexual partner, they wouldn't want to have sex with me. If I'm just curious about it and saying, oh, isn't that interesting? It's sort of like a interesting gray rainy winter day, and I'm just with what is. I can be grateful for what is. It doesn't mean like it's a day that I get to go running to the beach and have a fun day. It's cool, it's cozy, I'm indoors, And I have to just be grateful for that. And some days that's what your sex life is like. It's not a bright, funny, sun, athletic, fun, playful day. It's just maybe a little bit chilly or a little bit gray. And can we just be with each other in that and let that be the sex instead of this idea that it has to be intercourse and multiple orgasms, or the way we've seen it in pornography, or the way we see it in a magazine or a movie, because all of that creates judgment and it takes us out of the experience that we're having with our partner on this day. And in that gray, cold, wintry moment of sex, I bet you there's one moment of intimacy, one moment of beauty that you take away that has you connected to your partner if you let yourself. Derek asks, is performance anxiety a product of awkwardness? And I would say, yeah, it probably is, because you're in your head. Performance anxiety is all about me standing outside of myself, watching myself, and judging myself. So if I were doing that right now, I wouldn't be able to talk to you, because I'm really kind of talking the stream of consciousness. I'm answering questions that you have. If I was picking apart my hair and my eyeshadow and how old I look and what I have on, I wouldn't be able to say a word to all of you. I'd be incredibly awkward. I would be stumbling over my words. I would be more worried about myself and what's going on here than being in a genuine communication with you, and being genuinely to have some constructive and critical thinking about these really tough issues around sex and sexuality, which I don't have all the answers to. I've spent a good part of my career and my life studying this, so I have some expertise on the topic, but I'm not perfect, and I'm not going to get it perfectly right for all of you. Any more than we're going to get it perfectly right in bed with our sex partners. So I would encourage those of you that struggle with performance anxiety, especially men, to see, and I know this is simpler than it sounds, but to take a deep breath and say to yourself, you know what? I don't have to do anything for this person. My responsibility here is to focus on my own pleasure, to feel what it's like to have my skin touched, to smell my partner's body, to let myself experience pleasure. And maybe I get an erection and maybe I don't. I don't care about that. What I care about is making eye contact with this person that I'm involved with, the feel of kissing with that person, the full body sensuality of sex that maybe includes arousal in that way, and maybe it doesn't. But I'm not going to fight myself. I'm not going to beat myself up for it. I'm not going to be putting all this pressure on myself to get an erection. I'm just going to let myself be and see what happens. And that is the most compassionate thing you can do for yourself and for your partner, by the way. And then just make the experiment and see what happens. Maybe you'll get an erection, maybe you won't. But you have greater chance of getting one if you take all this pressure off yourself than if you're constantly monitoring, watching, judging your performance. And that would be true for any act, really. If you're a musician, if you're an actor, if you're a public speaker, even if you're just giving a presentation at work, if you just let yourself be and stop hammering yourself and give yourself permission, then I think that's when magic happens. So over time, the impossible becomes merely difficult, and the difficult becomes easy, and with time, you'll experience your sexual ease as a thing of beauty. Now, I have to say I borrowed this from Stanislavski, who was, the famous Russian teacher who conceptualized the notion of method acting. And he was talking about the process of the actor or the artist. And he said, if you imagine learning to play a musical instrument, say a saxophone, and you don't know anything about playing the saxophone, or let's say you had a neighbor playing the saxophone, even worse. When you hear that person playing the saxophone, it sounds impossible, right? It's like nails grating on a chalkboard, and they practice every day religiously for an hour. But over time, the impossible becomes difficult. So it starts to become a little bit better. But month after month, year after year, what happens is the difficult starts to become easy. And before you know it, there's a thing of beauty that's emanating from your neighbor where he or she's playing the saxophone in the most outrageous, fantastic way that you actually look forward to hearing them play that instrument. And sex, I think, is the same way, where it feels impossible, but you've got to be willing to make it difficult and know that you've done so many other things in life that you never thought you could do. That were difficult, and over time with practice there was an ease about them, and if you really stay with it, there's a mastery and it becomes a thing of beauty. So trust your body and trust that your body will become a thing of beauty also. So with the daily sex acts, with awkwardness, one of the things we write is set sail on a course of sexual healing by committing to address just one issue that will help you move out of awkwardness. So what's the one thing you need to do to feel less awkward? Maybe it's just by owning your shame and saying to your partner, you know what? I really have a lot of shame about oral sex. That's why I cringe when you do it or you bring it up. So I just want to talk about this shame and where it comes from for me. I just want to tell you that even bringing this up makes me feel super vulnerable. It makes me feel like you won't love me or you won't want me as a sex partner. That's the first order of business, is when you think about the one thing you can do to move out of awkwardness, it's to make yourself vulnerable and talk about your shame. And does this mean that you have to go to therapy for the first time to address child sexual abuse you experienced as a child? It may mean that. It may mean that you've been sort of bootstrapping it this whole time, or oftentimes what happens is when we're sexually abused as children, we don't recognize it as abuse until later in life. And it's easy in your 30s to say, well, it wasn't that big of a deal. But yet I'm having a difficult time orgasming. Maybe it was a big deal. And intellectually, you might get that it's not a big deal, but your body is a different matter. The body is different than the intellect, okay? So you might get what happened, but you're still running these patterns in your autonomic nervous system that have to be unpatterned, and you've got to do that with the help of a professional. So Zarina writes, I have a question about seduction and awkwardness. Women are expected to be seductive. What if I just don't feel seductive and the expectations of my partner are not met? What to do with that? Well, I think seduction is an interesting word because we can be seductive in many ways. You know, cooking a meal for someone can be a form of seduction. Humor can be a form of seduction. Intellectual banter can be a form of seduction. I think when people hear seduction, they have this picture in their mind of like a striptease or coming on to somebody in this way. That's a form of seduction. Flirtation can be seductive. But if you don't feel like being seductive, then your partner's not going to know, male or female, whether you're in the mood to be sex, because sex comes, or seduction comes in the form of a knowing glance, a flirtation, touching your partner in a certain way. You are giving messages, you're making bids for connection that lets the other person know that you have a green light. So to be sitting there and saying, you know what, I'm not feeling particularly seductive, but I want you to seduce me and I want to have sex with you, could be kind of seductive to somebody. You're saying, I'm not doing anything. And that may be arousing to somebody who wants to sort of seduce you out of that neutral state. But this requires a give and take between you and your partner. If your partner has an expectation that you're going to seduce him or her every time, and you feel like, gee, I don't want to be the seductress all the time, you need to have a conversation about that, because otherwise you'll just kind of go into a neutral gear and then you won't have sex, and then your partner will figure out that something's up. But that's also can be passive aggressive if you just stop doing what you've normally been doing and don't say anything about it. That can be a form of punishing the other person. So be careful about that. But I think, as always, this goes back to a conversation that we have with each other. We have an email question that says, is there a sexual guide of some kind that you could offer that would help initial awkward conversation, like a workbook that we could do together to start us down the right path? We're both still in therapy, but as a couple seem to need a little guidance. Well, I have a workbook that's coming out this spring. It's called the Katehakis Integrative Sex Therapy Model, or KIST. This book is predominantly for people who have had affairs and they're restoring their sexuality, but there are a lot of very specific questions in this workbook about what you like sexually, what you don't like sexually, what turns you on, what your sexual values are, how your sexual preferences tie to your sexual values. So that's a workbook couples can use. In the Erotic Intelligence, which again was written expressly for people that are in recovery from sex addiction, there are a lot of good questions in that workbook about, what the messages that you got about sex and sexuality from your family. So that's a starting conversation, is like, well, what did your parents teach you about sex and sexuality, or what was your first sexual experience like? I mean, that's an awkward conversation. It certainly is for me. It wasn't necessarily a pleasant experience for me. And so talking about that with a partner, I think, is really important. So those are a couple suggestions, but I would say, talk about your firsts. If you want to talk about awkward, talk about the first time you masturbated. How'd you figure that out? Who knew about it? Did anybody know about it? What are the ways that you like to masturbate? Because we don't talk about masturbation. Everybody thinks men masturbate more than women, but that's not true. So there are ways that you can start to talk about things by starting out by saying, okay, this is really awkward, but I want to ask you about the first time you had sex with somebody, or the first time you masturbated, or what's the craziest thing you did sexually, and did you like it or didn't you like it? What's the most shameful thing you did sexually? Is there something you want to do sexually with me that we haven't talked about? So I think you don't really need a workbook. I think people are always looking to things to guide them. I think if you go inside and ask yourself, what is the question I'm most uncomfortable asking my partner? That should be your question that you ask. And let it be goofy and awkward. But you are presumably love each other. You're in a relationship with each other. So this is the deal. This is what relationship's about. It helps us to stretch and grow with each other. So you may, and as I've said, you may feel awkward about a certain sex act, and so do you need to talk to your partner about that? So today is the day to take action, because it is January 2018, and this is the time we're all sort of rejuvenated to state intentions for the new year, to set goals. Maybe one of your goals is to be more honest about your sex and sexuality, and to look at where you've repressed the things that you really like because you have a judgment about it, or you're worried your partner has a judgment about it, and talk through it. And I promise you, it's never as bad as we think it's going to be. Once we talk through it, you might even have a good laugh. And that is the best thing that two people can do together anyway, I think. And don't be afraid to laugh during sex, or to feel like it's goofy or awkward or weird. Nobody's watching, hopefully. And it's just the way it is. Sometimes sex can be incredibly erotic and hot and exciting, and sometimes it can be sweet and simple. Sometimes it doesn't include intercourse. Sometimes it can be goofy and funny, or an epic fail. Whatever it is, don't judge it. Just know that's part of your humanity, and have compassion for yourself and for your partner, so you can keep trying new and different things. So finally, we're ending on this note, as always, about Mirror of Intimacy. I want to thank you always for your patronage of our book, and for turning people onto the book and to these webinars as well. I want to wish you all a very healthy, happy, and sexually juicy and robust 2018. And I look forward to talking with you in February. Take care. Bye-bye.